Hello, and welcome to episode number 109 of the Point of Convergence podcast. As always, I am your host, ExoAcademian. In recent times, considerable focus has been on the march towards some form of official UAP disclosure. Throughout that period, momentum has been arising from congressional attempts to surface information in light of intelligence gathered within various branches of the military and the intelligence community. That is to say, based on data and assessments from within the government itself. Based on this government-centric approach, one might come to the illusory conclusion that this is the only real source of information available, the main repository of raw data, if you will. In reality, though, nothing could be further from the truth. While many assume the only way ufology will gain traction in the mainstream is if and when government makes some sort of official acknowledgement of the data they have amassed over the decades, myriad compelling and data-rich reports already exist in the public at large. A key, but often underrepresented and underdiscussed component of that data available within the public domain arises from people of indigenous descent. These peoples, often also referred to as First Nations, or more colloquially within the United States as American Indians, have a remarkably deep and diverse lore pertaining to these matters. And this lore not only touches on a plethora of encounters with non-human and non-conventionally human intelligences over many generations, but it also speaks to a self-understanding of origins related to these very so-called star people. Part of the challenge in having these reports considered as part of the ongoing data gathering efforts has been that these peoples, so often marginalized in the mainstream, have been reticent to share their accounts with the public at large. This is where Dr. Artie Six Killer Clarke's legacy comes in. She is both a university professor and herself of Cherokee/Choctaw descent, and this has provided her unique access to these underrepresented peoples. Furthermore, Clarke has dedicated years of her life to visiting these various tribes in both North and South America and diligently recording their accounts for posterity's sake. What's fascinating about Clarke's work is not just how vast a body of data it is, but also how incredibly diverse it is. Her work, perhaps more than any other researcher of recent memory, uncovers just how many different forms of non-human and, just as importantly, non-conventionally human intelligences appear to be in our midst, even teasing the possibility that some of these non-conventional life forms have relationships and perhaps even genetic links with particular ethnicities amongst the present Earth population. And these are precisely the fascinating and consequential matters we'll seek to engage with in this, the 109th episode of the Point of Convergence podcast. As we begin this week's episode, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you would like to support this podcast and my work in general, and in so doing gain access to all of my content, which includes Point of Convergence, Liminal Frames, and Event Horizon, as well as the first 50 archived episodes now remastered of the Point of Convergence podcast, along with early access and discounts to online courses and in-person retreats, as well as dedicated premium podcasts, including OTC Squared and the various feature series I create, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. All right, with that preamble aside, let's dive into today's episode. Today we're going to be discussing more of Dr. Artie Six Killer Clarke's work. We've discussed her work before on 3 different episodes. She's written several books that basically catalog accounts of people of indigenous descent. These are really fascinating accounts, and as I pointed to in the introduction there, also incredibly diverse accounts. In fact, the diversity of those accounts, as well as some of the commonalities amongst just these particular indigenous reports, raises interesting questions about different origin possibilities. And as I mentioned in the introduction there, part of many indigenous people's self-understanding points to the notion that they arose from some of these so-called star people, and that they have an ongoing relationship, and that this relationship may even play a key role at the end of time or at the end of one particular epoch of time. Now, in speaking of the fact that the star people are a key part of indigenous understanding as to their own origins and perhaps their own destiny, this is true of Dr. Clark's experience as well. And she writes about this in the opening preface to this book. And by the way, the book we're discussing today that has these various accounts we're going to be discussing today is titled Encounters with Star People, Untold Stories of American Indians. So quoting from the preface, quote, I first learned about the quote-unquote star people when my grandmother told me the ancient legends of my people. My childhood reality included narratives that trace the origins of the indigenous people of the Americas to Pleiades, stories of little people who intervened in people's lives, and legends about the magical gift of the DNA of the quote-unquote star people that flowed in the veins of the indigenous tribes of the earth. I embraced the stories of the celestial visitors who lived among the Indian people as part of my heritage. When I reached adulthood, I put aside the stories of my childhood. It was not until I became an assistant professor at Montana State University in 1980 that the ancient stories of my upbringing took on another meaning. During my first year on faculty, I met a colleague who took me to a site overlooking his reservation village and suggested that we wait for, quote-unquote, the ancestors. He explained that the ancestors were the star people. She goes on to say, over the next 20 years, I collected almost 1,000 stories from indigenous people in the United States, Canada, Mexico, Central and South America, Australia, New Zealand, and the South Pacific. The majority of the stories were stored on tapes along with copious notes from the interviews. After my retirement, I transcribed the tapes and organized my notes. This manuscript, which reports my interviews with American Indians within the continental United States and Alaska, is the result of my research. It is a collection of unique, intimate narratives of encounters that occurred among American Indians and the star people. The stories you will read were told by people from all walks of life: fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, sons, daughters, and laborers. And she finishes this one opening section by saying, quote, some anthropologists have suggested that two perspectives, etic and emic, can be employed in qualitative research. The etic perspective is the outsider's interpretation of the experiences of that culture. An emic perspective refers to the way the members of the culture envision their world. In other words, the emic perspective is an insider's point of view. Thus, as an American Indian researcher, I chose to approach the research from an insider's perspective, an emic viewpoint. In doing so, I never questioned the existence of the star people, nor was I skeptical of the encounters, regardless of how unique or outlandish they might appear to an outsider. Unquote. We're now going to jump into our first account from this book, which again is Encounters with Star People, Untold Stories of American Indians, by discussing one account from a couple that ran into a situation that involved cattle mutilation, which again is a key component of the lore in general. So it's very interesting to have a first-hand account here. I want to quote from this one section, quote, at the time of our meeting in the spring of 2007, Tim had been a member of the tribal police force for 15 years and was now assigned to the juvenile division. In his off time, he worked with high-risk youth on the reservation. Sarah, a high school teacher, also spent hours volunteering in the high-risk youth program sponsored by the tribe. On any given weekend, the couple could be found chaperoning teen dances or supervising various program activities involving youth. Our encounter occurred on November 26, 2006, Sarah began. It was our 20th wedding anniversary, and we decided to go to Billings for the weekend. We were both excited and looking forward to a couple of days away from the reservation and some time alone. Tim got off work around 4 p.m. on Friday evening. Unquote. And now I'm going to jump to the section of the book where they have their encounter. Quote, It was about an hour after we left home. There are some sharp turns on the 2-lane highway before the interstate. As we came around one corner, we came upon some dead cattle along the side of the road, Tim said. And with Tim being the policeman that he is, Sarah interrupted, he insisted that we stop. Then Tim continues, I retrieved my handgun from the console and a portable spotlight that I carry with me for emergencies, and got out of the pickup. The first thing I noticed was that the air smelled different. Metallic is the best word I can use to describe it. It was like being in a machine shop where metal is being filed. I counted 3 dead cattle. It was obvious that some strange thing had occurred. Various incisions had been made in the animals. Eye sockets were without eyes. Ears were missing. Skin was shaved from the legs of 2 of the cattle, and one of the cows had all 4 legs missing. A head was sheared off and missing from the 3rd cow. The strangest thing was that there was no evidence of a struggle. There was no blood on the ground where the deadly acts were supposedly committed. There were no footprints, and I found that strange because the grass was almost waist high and there should have been some signs of the culprits, but there was nothing. Tim paused as the waitress placed drinks in front of us. He continued, the strangest part of the whole scene was that it was not like a butcher chopped off a head or an ear. These were precise cuts, very smooth. Sarah then picked up the story. When Tim got back in the truck, we decided we should report the event to someone, and while we were trying to decide what to do, I heard Tim say, "Look at that." I turned and looked out the windshield in the direction he was pointing. I couldn't see anything. I leaned down towards his lap, and that's when I saw it. A dim light was moving just behind the trees. As I lay there watching the light, I saw it moving towards us. Tim tried to start the pickup, but when he turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. I was really scared. I reached for my cell phone, but there was no reception. Then Tim says, we watched the light for a few minutes. That's when we realized it was more than a light. It looked like a large cylindrical propane tank. It moved full circle around the vehicle as if studying us. It was huge, the length of a football field at least. Then Sarah interjected and said, I was frightened. There was no question about it. I told Tim we had to leave, but every time he tried the key, the ignition did not respond. That's about the time the craft settled over the pickup, shining light so bright that it blinded us. I reached for Tim's hand, and that is the last thing I remember, until we found ourselves sitting in the truck on the opposite side of the highway from where we originally parked. The craft had disappeared, but even more perplexing, the cattle were gone too. I walked up and down the road shining the spotlight in every direction, and there were no cattle, Tim said, shaking his head in disbelief. Tim got back in the pickup, Sarah continued. We were both baffled that the cows disappeared. Tim reached down and turned the key in the ignition, and the truck started immediately. We got back on the road and drove toward Billings, unquote. Then they talk about checking into a hotel and looking over each other's bodies to see if there were any marks or anything, but there weren't, and they couldn't recollect what had happened during those missing hours. Now, after sharing this part of the story with her, the 3 of them then returned to the scene, and I want to quote from that section now. The next day, I followed Tim and Sarah to the site where the encounter occurred. It was about an hour from Billings. We pulled off the highway and walked to the spot where Tim saw the dead cattle. Off in the field, I noticed that a large herd grazed unattended. And then Tim said, shortly after we got to the hotel, I realized my gun was missing. I couldn't sleep once I made that discovery. We checked out of the hotel immediately and drove back to this spot where the encounter occurred. By that time, it was daylight. We pulled off the road and searched for my weapon. I was the one who found it, Sarah said, leading me across the road and pointing into the barrow pit. It was down over the hill there. It was like someone had thrown it away. But the strangest part, Tim said, was that the gun barrel was melted. He walked to his pickup and reached underneath the driver's seat. Take a look at this. He handed me the gun. I examined it carefully. From all appearances, the gun seemed like any other .357 Magnum, but a closer examination revealed a barrel that was completely closed. It looked like it had been melted. It was a solid piece of metal. I turned the gun over and over in my hand and returned it to Tim. Whoever they are, they don't like guns, Tim said. Unquote. Now, in terms of cattle mutilations, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is part of the lore. This is tied in somehow. That researchers who have looked into this are convinced this is not human culprits that are responsible for these cattle mutilations, at least not most of them. And it's also been pointed out to me that many of these cases involved rewards that were being offered, cash rewards, pretty considerable cash rewards to solve the cases, and yet almost all of these remain unresolved. I also want to add something here, and this is an interesting and potentially pertinent fact. The cattle mutilations peaked in 1975 in terms of how many were reported. That same year, beef consumption amongst humans was highest in the U.S. at 95 pounds consumed per person per year. Now, this correlation at least introduces the possibility that these cattle were being taken and studied in various ways in light of how they may impact the human population in terms of our diet, especially considering how much we were eating at the time and changes that were being made to grow these cattle using non-organic, non-natural means and additives and such. All right, we're now going to move on to our next account that involves a crash of a craft of apparently non-human origin on a ranch upon Indian territory on a reservation. So this was not something that the general public would have beheld. And in fact, some of these ranches involved pretty sprawling territory. So only one person saw that initially. This was this one person's grandfather. Let's now jump into this account. Quote, "If you stand right here," he said, pointing to the toe of his boot, "and look toward the horizon, that is where the ranch begins to the south." I looked in the direction he indicated. The ranch was expansive. At one point, I stopped and turned 360 degrees. There were no neighbors, no structures, nothing in sight except an old one-room log cabin and a 900-square-foot ranch-style shoebox house, typical of reservation homes. Pointing to the log cabin, Harrison remarked, "My grandfather lived in that cabin until the day he died. Back in the early 1980s, the tribe insisted that he participate in the mutual help program, and this ranch house was built. He stayed in it one night, as I recall, and then moved back into his log cabin. The main house stood vacant for years except when relatives came to visit. Then they would stay in the new house. Over the years, it suffered from a lack of attention." "Did you say a spaceship crashed on this property?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "In fact, I saw the ship. I went aboard it. It was a long cylinder, about 30 feet wide and 60 feet long. I measured it by pacing it off. Most of it stuck inside a butte close to the water level," he said, pointing to a reservoir that lay in the valley below. "It was well camouflaged. You can't see the butte now. It was covered by water when the Corps of Engineers flooded the valley, creating the reservoir." "How did your grandfather find the craft?" I asked. "The crash shook the ground so hard that Gramps thought the house was going to collapse. You can still see a crack in the foundation of the log cabin that Gramps said occurred when the spaceship crashed. The horses were so frightened that it took a month to round them up, and even then they were constantly trying to escape. At first, Gramps thought it was an earthquake, but when he ran outside, he saw a huge dust cloud blocking the western sky. When the dust cleared, he saw the craft. It hit with such force that only a small section stuck out of the butte. But Gramps not only had a keen eye, he knew this land like the back of his hand. The smallest disturbance caught his attention. For the longest time, he sat on the butte watching for any sign of life. He kept a vigil for days. Finally, after a week or more, he ventured to the place of impact." "Did your grandfather see any beings?" "He said the starmen who crashed survived and lived in their craft for about 5 months before they were rescued. At the time of the crash, the closest ranch to our place was 10 miles away, and as fate would have it, those neighbors had moved out of state days before the crash occurred. Gramps delighted in keeping the starmen's presence a secret." "How did he approach them?" "He went hunting and took them food, but he said they told him they did not eat flesh." "Did he describe them?" They were taller than him and white. He paused for a moment and then continued. Gramps was over 6 feet tall. If they were taller by a foot, that would make the star visitors over 7 feet tall. He described them as being so white that you could almost see inside them. I'm not sure what he meant by that, except that he said their skin was thin. Harrison looked at his hands and then at mine. They had long, slender fingers, much longer than humans. Their hair was white. When the sun shined on it, Gramps said it looked like a halo surrounding their heads. He said that sometimes they looked like the angels depicted in the paintings of his Bible, except they did not wear gowns. Their eyes, too. He said they changed color depending on the light. That's an interesting observation. Did he make any comments about any other facial characteristics? He said they looked like they were all related. He thought they might be brothers and cousins. They looked so much alike that he had difficulty telling them apart. He said he could not tell their age, and they all seemed to be the same age. Some had longer hair than others, which was the only distinguishing feature he mentioned. Apparently he thought they were all male, I commented. I think that would be a fair assumption. He was particularly interested in their clothes. They wore a one-piece light green outfit. He told me there were times he saw them wading in the river, and when he approached them, their suits were dry. He told me he wished he had a suit like that. Harrison smiled, obviously remembering his grandfather. When I think of the old man and how he viewed the star visitors, he did his best to describe what he saw. I'm sure if the same thing occurred today, the observers might offer a more sophisticated perspective. It sounds like he was very observant, I said. Harrison smiled and nodded. There were 14 of them. Gramps was never sure if any died during the crash, but when I arrived for the summer, I went on board the craft. There were 17 seats. Was there any sign that anyone died in the crash? I asked. Harrison shook his head. None. Did your grandfather have a perspective on the purpose of their travel? Gramps said that he often saw the star people picking up rocks and plants. At first, when they saw him, they vanished before his eyes. Vanished? Yes, disappeared. He never discovered an explanation for that, but he wished he had that power. Gramps thought that was the ultimate trait, simply to vanish in thin air when you wanted. I can't imagine how he planned to use it. As time passed, Gramps said the starmen realized he meant no harm, and they didn't disappear when he approached. Over time, it became clear to him that they were concerned about their craft. They did not want it discovered. Did your grandfather tell you what happened to them? He said they lived here from late November until April. According to him, on April 17th, 1945, another spaceship appeared and he never saw them again. He knew they were waiting for a rescued craft, so he expected it. He told me their spaceship was one of 4 exploring the Earth. They had been dropped off by a bigger ship that was circling Earth. Dropped off? That's what Gramps understood. The big ship would return for them, but not for some time. They just had to wait. They were not afraid they would be discovered. They could make themselves invisible, but they could not do the same with their spaceship. Did your grandfather see the rescue? Apparently so. He said the rescue craft landed in the field to the west of the house. It was exactly like the one that crashed. He watched as they prepared to leave. Each of the stranded star travelers came to him and bowed before they left. He understood they appreciated his discretion. Before they left, did they make any efforts to conceal the spacecraft or destroy it? I asked. The spacecraft was no ordinary machine. Gramps said it had the capability to change shape and then resume its shape. I'm not sure I understand what you're telling me. When they crashed, the spaceship was damaged severely, but it made itself appear as part of the landscape. I do not know how to explain it. He paused for a moment and held his head in his hands. Gramps said that when he first saw the spaceship, there were dents and scrapes all over the backside and a big hole in it. The spacecraft shape-shifted and looked like a big boulder. He never understood how that happened. He also said that they tunneled further into the butte to conceal the craft so that only a part of the boulder could be seen with the naked eye. It matched the landscape. I actually saw that myself. The spaceship itself was silver, but there was a section where the dory was and the back end of the craft that looked like the desert soil of the butte. So they could change the external part of the craft, but they could not get the craft to work because of the crash? Is that correct? Yes, they told Gramps that they could not control the guidance. He did not understand that at all, and I'm not sure I do either. Maybe it would be like a plane without one wing or a ship without a rudder. What did your grandfather think about their ability to change the external part of the craft? He looked upon the spaceship as a living organism. He believed it was fixing or repairing itself. I never knew what to believe. I was too young, and now I am too old to figure it out. All I know is what Gramps told me and what I saw. Did the star people tell your grandfather the name of the place they called home? They told him that they came from a star system in the Taurus constellation. He said they called their world Enyan. It reminded me of the word Inyan, which coincidentally means rock in my language. Did they call it the Taurus constellation? I asked. Harrison shook his head. I discovered that it was the Taurus from a teacher in high school. The star visitors pointed out the constellation to him, and I asked my science teacher if that group of stars had a name. We looked it up together. Did they give him any indication as to why they were here? Graham said they were voyagers and traveled the universe observing life on other worlds. They had been coming to Earth for thousands of years observing, collecting data and noting changes. One day, they took him aboard their craft and showed him pictures from their home. As he described it, I suspect it was some kind of TV or computer, but in my grandfather's day, there was no such thing, so he was enthralled by what he called, quote, a picture machine. He talked about flashing pictures that showed a place different from Earth. It reminded him of the Badlands, but with no vegetation. Their houses were underground. He asked them if it was heaven, and they told him they did not have a place such as heaven. He was fascinated by the picture machine and went back several times to view the pictures. Apparently the star visitors told him they liked the green of Earth, and they thought the red willow that grew along the banks of the river was quite beautiful in April. They loved the water. On their world, water was underground, nothing on the surface. My grandfather frequently collected geodes for them. They were amazed when he broke them open to reveal the crystallized cities inside. They were apparently pleased to add them to their collection. Gramps also taught them the medicinal uses of the red willow and how to propagate it from a small sample. Did your grandfather learn about their spiritual beliefs? He told me they were curious about heaven. I remember he said he told them two versions, the white man's Bible and the Indian version. He paused and laughed. He often talked about the happy hunting ground, so I suspect he told them all about that. When I arrived at the ranch in late May, the starmen were gone. By this time, the entrance to the craft had been concealed, but Gramps showed me how to access the inside of the craft from an invisible door near the rear that was so well camouflaged that even the most astute observer would not have seen it. I entered through the door and examined the craft. What do you remember about it? The craft was well hidden inside the butte where it crashed. It was so well hidden that anyone passing by would have missed it. But if you wiped the dirt away, there was a smooth, dull metallic surface underneath. It was not round like a saucer. It was long and sleek like a rocket I had seen in comic books. I counted 17 seats. I sat in one, and it melted around me. Melted? The chair melted around me. My first reaction was that I was trapped and I was frightened. Just as I struggled to escape, the chair released me. After that, I tried the chair again and again. Each time it enveloped me like a warm hug and then released me when I wanted to get up. It was like it anticipated my desire to stand. Can you describe the inside of the craft? Everything inside the craft was the same dull gray metal, even the seats. But the seats, they were warm and comforting like an embrace. I expected the seats would be hard and cold, but they weren't. They were soft and soothing. I can still close my eyes and imagine the feeling. He paused as though collecting his thoughts and continued. The surface inside the craft was smooth, the walls, the seats, and floors almost austere. There were screens and buttons and knobs. There were characters written under some of them. At that time, I did not understand them at all. Now I would say that they were a type of hieroglyphics, but I knew nothing of those things when I was 12. He shook his head and took out a pack of gum and offered a piece to me. There was another room or space behind the chairs. It was a smaller area and contains a huge round cylinder encased in a huge glass-like ball. I never knew what that was. I remember looking for weapons, but found none. There was a thick, slimy substance like honey stored in clear containers along one wall. When I lifted them from the shelf, they offered resistance, like they were glued to the spot. But now I think it might have been magnetism. I'm not sure. I think they must have taken everything they brought with them when their base ship returned. The craft was clean except for those jars. What did they contain? I wanted to take one of the containers home, but the old man said it was not a good idea. He said that it could contain medicine not meant for us, and that they should stay with the craft. I opened one and smelled the contents. The scent took my breath away. It seemed like a compost pile, like decaying soil and waste. Gramps was sure it was their medicine. How did this craft remain secret all these years? This is the reservation. An entire fleet of spaceships could land out here and no one would know. You have to remember the time, too. This reservoir was constructed in the 50s and early 60s. Even today, there are few whites who've entered down this way, and Indians do not have boats. It is too far inside the reservation territory for much traffic. Secondly, few people live out this way. It's 20 miles from the highway, and it's not a place that attracts visitors. And besides, the craft was well concealed by rock and dirt. You had to almost walk up to it to even notice it. The way it was embedded into the rock and dirt made it look like part of the natural terrain. Then when the Army Corps of Engineers came and built the dam, they flooded the area and the evidence was covered with water. He paused for a moment and then added, that is, unless the Army people discovered it and hauled it away. Did your grandfather ever tell anyone about the Star People? No one except me, and I was sworn to secrecy, and maybe a couple of his boyhood friends. He told me the land where they crashed was his land, and as far as he was concerned, they were his guests. When the corpse came, he knew the star travelers were gone, and so he kept their secret. Do you think the spaceship is still there, hidden under millions of gallons of water? When they came to build the reservoir, I was here. Gramps was upset that they were taking his land, but even more distraught that they had cordoned off a part of his land that contained the crash site. It was not long before they told him that he would have to evacuate his house until they completed the blasting. They put him up in a motel off the reservation for several weeks. I stayed in town with him that summer. We had 2 double beds and a meal pass at the local restaurant. It was an interesting time. Gramps behaved like a caged animal. He hated the motel and the restaurant food. We spent hours walking the dirt roads out of town. He worried about his horses and cattle. He was afraid they would not have water. Some days, when it was too hot outside to walk, I read Western paperbacks or we played checkers or poker. When did you return to the ranch? It was somewhere near the end of July. I remember it took most of August to round up the horses and cattle for winter. I worried that I would not be able to help him get the job done before I had to return to school in the fall. Had the place changed in your absence? When we arrived, the landscape was totally changed. They moved tons of dirt. Where there was once a field, now there were hills. It was impossible to even figure out where the butte had been. Gramps believed they found the spaceship and hauled it away. He was probably right. Why did your grandfather believe they found the craft? He told me that one of the engineers visited him one day. He talked about the inaccessibility of the ranch. He asked Grandpa if he ever saw anything strange. I guess Gramps told him that he went to bed when it got dark and got up when the sun came up and didn't have much time for anything else. Gramps said he played dumb to his questioning, but he understood the implications of the Inquisition. How many times did you go back to the craft after that first visit? Regretfully, I never returned to the spaceship. I wanted to, but Gramps said that it was a sacred place and we should not look upon it as a curiosity or something to explore. In those days, kids listened to their elders. I never went back." Unquote. And now we're going to jump into our next encounter, which took place in Alaska, but also involved a mishap where happenstance was such that a person driving a large truck ran across an alien who had been caught in a blizzard. Artie Clark asks, is that where you had your encounter? No, it was during a blizzard back in February. It was on my assigned stretch of the highway. Do you mean 2 months ago in February? Yes, 2 months ago. I was here, snowbound in the motel down the street during the blizzard. That storm was terrible, set all records from what I remember. I was called out about 1 a.m. in the morning. It was an unexpected storm. It caught everyone off guard. The winds were upwards of 50 miles an hour, and the wind chill hovered at 70 below. There are 2 of us who cover the 50-mile stretch of the highway. I start in the north. My partner comes from the south. We drive up and back over that stretch of the highway, keeping the roads clear. Sometimes we drive 18-hour shifts, sometimes more. About an hour into my shift that night, I got a call from Bill, the other driver, that there was a strange glow up ahead. He asked if I saw it. Before I had a chance to respond, I came upon a disc setting in the middle of the highway. It covered the full 2 lanes. It was round with bright orange lights around the bottom. I stopped within 20 feet of it. I flipped my lights up and down. I tried calling Bill, but my radio was dead. Suddenly, blinding white lights came on and the craft moved upward and was gone. I watched until it was out of sight, but that was not long, as the storm cut the visibility that night to nearly 0. When it was gone, there was darkness all around me. I sat there for a moment. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. It was at that moment I realized my engine was off. I never turn off the engine for fear it would not turn over again in the extreme temperatures, but it was off. I held my breath when I turned the key in the ignition, and fortunately the engine came to life on the first try. I put it in gear and began to move forward. Just as I got up a little speed, I felt a bump under my right tire as though I had run over something. That freaked me out. I thought it might be something from the spacecraft. I stopped the plow and readied myself to go outside. As I tied the string of my parka under my chin, I saw a hand reach up and pound on the side window. Then a second hand appeared. What did you do? I turned on the lights inside the cab and suddenly a face appeared and stared at me. It wore some kind of protective gear on its face, but I saw the eyes, big dark eyes staring at me. Suddenly it turned and ran across the road to a stand of trees and disappeared. Where did it go? Just like I said, it ran across the road into the woods. I had no intentions of following it. Leaving a vehicle in a blizzard could have been deadly. I thought that was the end of it, but it wasn't. Suddenly, the creature reappeared in the middle of the road ahead of me. Somehow I understood that it was cold and needed a place of shelter. I offered him to come inside my snowplow, but he wanted nothing to do with it. How are you communicating with this being, and why are you now referring to the creature as a male? I don't know. The creature seemed more male than female. Anyway, he stood in the middle of the road and told me he was cold and it was my fault. Your fault? He said the craft took off without him. He was outside when I came upon the craft. In their haste to evacuate the scene, the other crew members left without him. What did you do? I invited him inside the snowplow again. I told him I had to clear the roads and I could not leave him outside in the cold. Reluctantly, he came inside, but not like you and I would climb inside. He just appeared. 1 minute he was standing in the middle of the road, the next minute he was inside the cab with me. How did you feel about that? I would be lying to you if I said it didn't scare me. I was nervous and frightened. I just remembered what my grandfather had taught me and stayed calm. I went into survival mode, I guess. That was the longest night of my life. I made it to my destination uneventfully. All the time the space traveler was riding shotgun in the passenger seat. I think we made an unusual pair. What do you recall about the trip with your new passenger? Once I made it to the 50-mile point, I turned around and began the journey back again. It was snowing hard. The roads were covered with another 4 inches of snow. On the return trip, the spacecraft appeared again in the middle of the road at the exact same spot as I encountered it earlier. The starman suddenly disappeared. Within seconds, I saw him in front of the craft. The pulsating lights outlined his shape, and in the dim light I detected a brief and simple salute or a wave directed toward me and then he was gone. He just disappeared in the night along with the craft. Did you ever learn anything about why they were on the highway in the first place? He told me the craft had malfunctioned. They were set down in the middle of the road only momentarily for repairs. He was curious and had gone outside to do some testing of the snow. They didn't realize it was a highway because of the storm. When I came upon them, my appearance shocked them, and in their confusion they took off without him. They had not expected anyone to appear in the middle of the storm. To add to his dilemma, they were not allowed to make human contact, so he was uneasy about being discovered. So they immediately took off, leaving him behind. In the process, they violated several rules of their travel. He said they were a young crew and would likely lose their rights as explorers if their superiors discovered their mistake. That's an incredible story. It's a true one, but if someone told me this happened to them, I'm not sure I would believe them. It sounds fake, but it's not. I swear to God, it's the truth. I've heard some remarkable stories. None like yours, I will admit, but I do believe you. Your experience, while different, simply builds on so many other stories that I've heard. That's another thing. He was fascinated with a snowplow and how it worked. He considered it a rather primitive machine, but one that he was curious about. He told me that humans put too much reliance on oil-based machines. He said they should spend their energy studying the use of magnetic propulsion for travel. He could not understand why our scientists had not gone in this direction. Can you remember anything else? He had never experienced snow before or the extreme cold. He said on his planet, the weather never varied. He had never been so cold in his entire life and hoped never to repeat the experience. Unquote. Now, earlier on, we discussed a case involving cattle mutilation, and that was useful in informing us about some of the context around this key part of the lore. Another key part of the lore involves UFOs, UAP, being in and around missile silo sites, nuclear facilities, nuclear weapons facilities. And the next couple of accounts that are related are going to discuss just such a case. This took place in South Dakota around a missile site. The first person we're going to hear about is a man named Jake. Quote, in 1993, a 28-year-old Lakota truck driver was hauling a load of new pickup trucks to a dealership in Pierre, South Dakota. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning when he saw flickering lights approaching him on a lonely section of the highway. At first, he thought it was another truck driver who had forgotten to hit his low beams. He flashed his high beams on and off, but when he did so, the object lifted straight up from the ground and then zoomed in his direction. It came directly at me. It probably cleared the cab by no more than 10 feet. It makes me nervous thinking about it. I pulled off to the side of the road to collect my thoughts and calm my nerves, but I did not see the craft again. Do you remember anything about the craft? It was a huge triangle-shaped craft. I estimate it was twice as long as my truck and several times wider, at least at the widest part. Bright white lights outlined the thing against the sky and the entire countryside around my truck. I know one thing for sure, it was not of this earth. Why do you say that? Well, for one thing, what would a craft like that be doing in South Dakota skies at 2 in the morning? And where did it come from? Maybe Ellsworth or even Maelstrom, Artie suggested. I don't think so. I spent 4 years in the military. I think I saw most every aircraft in our arsenal of flying machines. That was not one of ours. I am positive. Besides, why would one of our aircraft hover above a missile silo site and then zoom away when it was detected? Afterwards, I tried to alert other drivers on my CB, but there was nothing but static. I had to drive 10 miles down the road before I could even raise anyone. Even then, there was a lot of static. And then Artie asks, did you talk to anyone else who saw the craft? Not a soul, he replied. Unquote. And now we're going to jump forward in the narrative to a different occasion where this man, along with his sister, approaches Artie again to say that he's had a similar encounter. Quote, it happened again, he declared. It was close to midnight at the same place. This time, when I saw the lights ahead, I knew what to expect. I pulled off the side of the road and began flashing my lights. Immediately, the craft became airborne. This time I jumped outside my truck. I watched it pass overhead. It was like a huge solid boomerang. He traced the outline of a triangle on the table. It had 7 lights, 1 on the front tip, 2 on each side, and 2 in the back. They were bright white lights. Within seconds, it was gone. It zigzagged across the sky and disappeared. Afterwards, I walked to the missile site. The smell of sulfur was heavy upon the air. The site is fenced, so there is no way I could get inside the area, but the craft was definitely hovering over the missile site." Unquote. And now we're going to jump into an account of 2 other people who had a similar kind of account, and then something that happens to them afterwards. These people are named Louis and Ginger. Quote, "I met Louis and Ginger at a National Indian Education Conference in 1981. Ginger and I had been selected to serve on a panel related to research about American Indian youth and alcohol abuse. It was not until I had known them for several years that they told me their story. It happened back in 1989, as I recall," Louis began. "Ginger and I had stopped for a hamburger at a truck stop on Highway 212. It was about 9 p.m. We had only been back on the road for about 10 minutes when we saw a bright red light up ahead near the highway. Ginger was the first to mention it. I asked Louis what he thought it was," Ginger said. "We traveled that road many times, but I never remembered seeing anything like that light before." "I thought that it might have been a new radio tower," Louis said. "I had no explanation. I had never seen a red light in the sky on this road before, and I have traveled this road hundreds of times. I grew up here. This was my home." Then Ginger adds, "As we drove, we became aware that there was something different about the light. It was getting brighter and brighter. Before long, we knew it was not a tower." "It was a UFO," Louis said, "and it was hovering over a missile site located along the side of the road. There wasn't a person who lived in this area that didn't know about the missile silos. The above-ground portion of the place where security personnel were stationed around the clock looked like it had only a modest rancher's home. There was no visual clues to the missiles that waited below in case of a nuclear war, but we all watched it being built, so we knew." "When we came upon the missile site," Ginger commented, "we realized what was happening. Louis pulled off the road. At this point, we were on the opposite side of the highway, no more than 50 feet from the object. It was suspended in mid-air, about 30 feet above the missile site. Bright lights covered the entire area. We did not see any military at all." Then Louis interjects, "Both of us were just amazed. We couldn't believe it." "As we sat there not moving," Ginger continued, "suddenly the craft crossed the road and came directly towards us. We leaned back and watched it pass over us through the sunroof of the car. It was V-shaped, a triangle. There was a red light in front and 6 bright white lights. Once it passed overhead, we jumped out of the car and watched it, and at some point we decided to follow it." Then Louis says, "I turned around in the middle of the road and followed it. It was strange. It was as though they read our minds, and they waited for us. When we caught up with them, we pulled off the highway and got out again. As soon as we did this, they took off again." Then Ginger adds, "It's almost like a cat and mouse game. We would chase them, and they would let us catch up with them, and then they would take off again." Then Louis adds, "Finally, they must have gotten tired of the game, because all of a sudden they performed a zigzag motion across the sky, and they disappeared. Reluctantly, we turned around and headed back towards the reservation." But then Ginger says, "But the story does not end there. The next night," Louis begins, "after we had finished our work, Ginger suggested that we take a drive to look for the UFO. As strange as it may sound, her suggestion sounded reasonable. So after a light supper, we headed out. We decided to take this gravel road that is out of the middle of nowhere. I had some cousins down the way, and we thought we might drop in and say hello." Then Ginger adds, "The 2-lane road goes through an area with some small hills. It was in that area that we saw it again." "Do you mean the UFO?" "Yes," said Ginger. "Again, a craft appeared, but this time, instead of a V-shaped craft, it was circular." Louis continues, "It was small, maybe 30 feet circumference. It continued the cat and mouse game, hiding behind the hills and then revealing itself to us on the other side. This must have gone on for a few moments when all of a sudden we topped the hill and it was setting on the middle of the road waiting for us." Louis slammed on the brakes, said Ginger, and we came to a stop only a few feet from it. At this point, I am frightened. I yelled to Louis to put the car in reverse and to get out of there, but he does not respond. I hear the door open and a bright light flooded over me. It is obvious they are taking us with them. I was worried about the car, said Louis. It was a brand new Mustang sports car. I was worried about someone coming upon it and thinking it was abandoned. These creatures who took us told us not to worry. I remember them saying that the car would be okay. They said they would take care of it. I have no memory after that, Ginger said. I remember the white light. Then Louis adds, I remember being on board the craft. I remember walking down a long hall and seeing others inside of rooms. I think I saw my cousin Reuben, but I could not be sure. They examined me, but didn't hurt me. All of the time I was worried about Ginger. They took her into another area, and I was worried about what they might do to her, but they told me not to worry. They would not hurt her. After I calmed down, they talked to me as their equal. They asked me about my work at Los Alamos. At one time, I had worked there. They talked to me about my work at Kirkland Air Force Base, where I had also worked. They took me to a monitor with displays of the universe and pointed out a star in the Pleiades group where they originated. When I asked them if they had ever seen our astronauts out in space, they told me that our program was more dangerous than beneficial. Did they tell you what they meant by that? Artie asked. They said that sometimes it is better to be insignificant and anonymous than to announce your presence to the universe. I took that to mean that there were civilizations that might not be friendly towards us. Can you describe the craft? I think we were aboard two different craft. The circular one was a shuttle of some sort that took us to a bigger ship. I remember descending steps and walking down a long, long hallway. It was nondescript, rounded edges, silver in color. Off the hallway were rooms. There were other people there. That's when I saw my cousin. I am positive he was there. Did you ever ask him about it? Never. For some reason, I think it must have been suggested to me not to talk about the event. In fact, Ginger and I never discussed it until one day, about 2 years later, she was sitting on the couch and suddenly said to me, "Do you remember the time we saw the UFO when we were on our way to your cousin Reuben's house?" That's when the memories came back, almost like a dam was open and all the water flooded in. Only in this case, it was memories of that night. Are you telling me that the two of you never even spoke of the events of that night? That's correct, said Louis. The next morning we woke up in bed. I looked out the window and the car was parked there. I wondered why I was so tired, but I took a shower and went back to work the next morning. I was here on a consultant job with the tribe. At the end of the day, we drove to Rapid City and caught our flight home. We never talked about it again until the night that Ginger mentioned it. Do you remember why you asked Louis the question about the UFO? Artie asks. I saw something on a TV news broadcast about someone reporting a UFO over the Ellsworth Air Force Base near Rapid City, said Ginger. And it jarred my memory, I guess. That's the reason I asked. And then Artie adds, I saw Louis and Ginger last October in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We were all there for the National Indian Education Convention. They asked if I had ever decided to write a book, and I told them I was working on it. We sat for a while and talked again about their experience. All the missile sites are gone now, Louis said. I haven't seen a UFO since they were moved. It is quiet in the South Dakota skies now. Unquote. And that's going to bring to a close this particular account, as well as our exploration into Artie Clark's book, Encounters with Star People, Untold Stories of American Indians. I would highly encourage the audience to pick up this book and read her other books as well, because, again, the contribution she's made to the field is tremendous and gives us access to accounts of Indigenous peoples that we would likely not know of otherwise. And on that note, we've come to the close of another edition of the Point of Convergence podcast. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/ExoAcademian or by subscribing on Spotify. But until next time, friends, from deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, this is ExoAcademian signing out.